The cruelest moment in that courtroom wasn't the attorney's voice reading the will aloud in a flat, emotionless tone. It was the sound of a single coin spinning on the polished mahogany table, $1, slid across by Victor Hale's lawyer like Rosa was a vending machine accepting spare change. His family erupted. Victor laughed the loudest, leaning back in his chair with the ease of a man who had already won everything. 40 years, he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. And that's your cut. Rosa Mendez stood at 65 years old, alone on her side of the table, staring at a coin her late godmother had supposedly left her, while Victor and his legal team divided the rest of what should have been her legacy. But just as she reached for that coin with trembling hands, a man she had never seen before was already on his feet. He didn't carry a briefcase, he carried car keys. "Don't touch that yet," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the laughter like a blade. "That coin isn't an insult, Mrs. Mendez. It's an address, and I have been waiting 20 years to drive you there." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rosa Mendez was born in a small coastal town in southern Texas to parents who had crossed the border with nothing but calloused hands and a stubborn belief that hard work would be enough. Her father laid tile, her mother cleaned houses. They raised Rosa and her two younger brothers in a two-bedroom rental that smelled of corn tortillas and pine sol, and they taught their children that dignity wasn't something you wore, it was something you built quietly, brick by brick, every single day. Rosa had been a bright student. Scholarships came naturally to her. She had earned a place at a respected state university with plans to study architecture. She had always loved the way buildings told stories, the way a well-designed space could make a person feel held or free or both at once. She sketched floor plans in the margins of her notebooks. She dreamed of designing homes for people who deserved beauty but couldn't afford it. She had a plan, a clear and purposeful plan, and she was 26 years old when Victor Hale walked into it and quietly dismantled everything. Victor was 31 when they met, tall and self-assured in the way that money and a good last name can produce in a man. He came from a family with old Texas wealth, not the flashy kind, but the quiet, deeply rooted kind that shows up in country club memberships and lake houses, passed down through generations. He was working in real estate development, ambitious and charming, and when he turned his full attention toward Rosa at a mutual friend's dinner party, she had been utterly unprepared for it. He was unlike anyone who had ever paid attention to her before. He asked about her architecture dreams with what seemed like genuine fascination. He took her to dinners she couldn't have afforded on her own, not to impress her, or so it seemed at the time, but simply because he wanted to share things he loved with someone he was beginning to love. He told her she was the most interesting woman he had ever met. He told her she made him want to be a better man. He proposed on the balcony of a rented villa in the Texas Hill Country, under a sky so thick with stars it looked painted, and Rosa said yes before he had even finished the sentence. She never went back to finish her architecture degree. It seemed romantic at the time. Victor was building something real, something that needed her support, her steadiness, her presence. She would be the foundation while he built upward. And for a while, a long while, that felt like enough. For 38 years, Rosa Mendez became Rosa Hale, though she kept Mendez quietly close to her heart, like something precious she was protecting. She raised their two children, Marco and Lucia, in the large colonial-style house Victor had built in an upscale suburb of San Antonio. She managed the household with the same precision she might have once applied to architectural blueprints. She hosted dinners for Victor's clients, charmed his business partners, remembered their wives' names and their children's ages and their preferred wine. She volunteered at the school, the church, the neighborhood association. She was everywhere Victor needed her to be and nowhere she had ever dreamed of being for herself. Victor's family was the particular kind of difficult that never announced itself directly. Genevieve Hale, Victor's mother, was a woman of deliberate elegance and cutting silences. She had never said outright to Rosa's face that she wasn't good enough. She didn't need to. It was in the way she had referred to Rosa's parents as the help in early conversations before Rosa quietly corrected her. It was in the way she spoke about Rosa's background with the strained tolerance of someone enduring something they considered beneath them. It was in the way she called Victor her son and looked at Marco and Lucia as if she were still in the process of deciding whether to fully claim them as grandchildren. Conrad, Victor's older brother, was blunter. He had once told Victor, within Rosa's earshot at a Christmas gathering, that he had married down. Victor hadn't defended her. He had laughed it off and changed the subject. Pamela, Victor's sister, had simply never acknowledged Rosa as a peer. Not in 38 years of holidays and birthdays and Sunday dinners. Rosa had been a fixture in their world, useful and present, but never quite belonging. Rosa had absorbed all of it. She had told herself it didn't matter, that families were complicated, that love was the point and not approval. She had told herself this so many times that it had started to feel true, until the year she turned 62, when Victor came home one evening and sat down at the kitchen table with the expression of a man delivering a business decision rather than the complete destruction of a marriage. He was leaving. There was someone else. Her name was Brianna. She was 29 years old, worked in his firm's marketing department, and Victor said, with the clinical detachment of a man who had rehearsed this conversation many times, that he simply hadn't been happy for years, and that Rosa deserved to know the truth. Rosa hadn't cried. Not then. She had stood at the kitchen counter with her hands pressed flat against the cold granite and looked at the man she had given her entire adult life to, and she had felt something she couldn't name. Not grief, not rage, not yet. Just a vast and echoing emptiness, like the moment before a building collapses when everything is still standing but something in the air already knows it won't be for long. The divorce proceedings took 2 brutal years. Victor had lawyers. Victor had assets carefully restructured into business entities. Victor had a machine, meticulously assembled over years, designed to ensure Rosa walked away with as little as the law would allow. But the real blow hadn't come from the divorce. It had come 6 months later, when Catalina Vega died. Catalina Vega had been the most important woman in Rosa's life for as long as Rosa could remember, and also the most mysterious. She had come into Rosa's world the way certain people do, not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with a quiet and absolute permanence that made it difficult to imagine a time before her. Catalina was her mother's oldest friend, a woman who had crossed the same border decades earlier under circumstances she rarely discussed, and who had settled in Texas with a stubbornness that the landscape itself seemed to respect. She had never married. She had no children of her own. And when Rosa was born, Catalina had stood at the baptismal font and accepted the role of godmother with the kind of seriousness that most people reserve for legal contracts. She was not a soft woman. She didn't bake cookies or offer easy comfort or say the kinds of gentle things that godmothers say in movies. When Rosa was 8 and came home crying because a girl at school had made fun of her hand-me-down shoes, Catalina had looked at her steadily and said, "The only people who mock what others wear are people who have nothing interesting happening inside their own heads. Remember that and stop crying." It had not felt kind at the time. Looking back, Rosa understood it had been the truest form of love Catalina knew how to offer, the kind that prepared you for the world rather than shielding you from it. Catalina had lived simply for her entire life. Deeply, almost aggressively simply. She rented a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood in San Antonio until her late 70s, drove a car that should have been retired a decade before she gave it up, wore clothes that were clean and pressed but clearly old, and spent her money, as far as anyone could see, on almost nothing at all. Rosa had assumed, the way everyone around her had assumed, that Catalina simply had very little, that she had worked modest jobs, seamstress work, alterations, some bookkeeping for small businesses, and had saved carefully and lived quietly within those modest means. When Rosa's marriage began to disintegrate, Catalina had been the one person who didn't try to fix it with words. She had simply called every Thursday evening, asked Rosa what she had eaten that day, and listened without interrupting for however long Rosa needed to talk. She had done this without fail until 8 months ago, when a stroke had taken her suddenly in her apartment, quietly, on a Thursday morning before she could make her evening call. Rosa had sat with her body at the hospital for 2 hours before calling anyone else. She had held Catalina's hand and talked to her, because it felt wrong to be silent, and because she wasn't sure she would ever find another person in her life who listened the way Catalina had listened. The news of Catalina's estate had come 3 weeks after the funeral, delivered by a letter from a law office Rosa had never heard of, a firm called Banks and Delgado, with an address in a part of the city she didn't know well. The letter informed her that as the sole named beneficiary of Catalina Vega's estate, Rosa was invited to attend a formal reading of the will. She had gone expecting almost nothing. She had told Marco and Lucia not to bother coming, that it was likely a small matter, perhaps some jewelry, perhaps a piece of furniture that had sentimental meaning. She had worn a simple dark dress and driven herself to the reading, her heart already heavy with the kind of grief that doesn't announce itself loudly but sits behind every ordinary moment like a low, persistent ache. What she had not expected was Victor. He was already in the conference room when she arrived, sitting at the long table with two of his attorneys flanking him and the familiar smug ease of a man who believed rooms were built around him. His brother Conrad sat behind him against the wall, arms crossed. Genevieve Hale was there as well, impeccable as always in a charcoal suit, her expression arranged into the particular blankness she deployed when she wanted to appear above whatever was happening around her. Rosa stopped in the doorway. Victor looked up and smiled with his teeth, the way he always smiled when he had already won something. "Rosa," he said, as though they were running into each other at a grocery store, rather than at the reading of her dead godmother's will. "Didn't expect to see you here." "This is my godmother's estate," Rosa said carefully. "Why are you here?" Victor's attorney, Harrison Cole, answered before Victor could. Harrison was the kind of lawyer who wore his confidence like a second suit, expensive, tailored, and designed entirely to intimidate. "Mr. Hale has filed a claim against the estate," he said, straightening his already straight papers, "on the grounds that assets accumulated by Ms. Vega during the period of your marriage may constitute marital property subject to division under the terms of your settlement agreement." Rosa felt the room tilt slightly. "Catalina didn't have assets," she said, more to herself than to anyone in the room. Harrison Cole smiled the smile of a man holding cards he hadn't shown yet. "That," he said, "is a matter of some debate." The estate attorney, a quiet older man named Gerald Fitch, who seemed deeply uncomfortable with everything happening in his conference room, cleared his throat and began to read. The will was straightforward in its language, almost plain. Catalina Vega, of sound mind and deliberate intention, left her entire estate to her goddaughter, Rosa Mendez. There were no other named beneficiaries. There were no exceptions, no conditions, no subclause that acknowledged Victor Hale or his attorneys or his claim in any way. The estate, as documented, consisted of one item, one United States dollar coin, dated 1987, to be presented to Rosa Mendez at the time of reading. The room fell absolutely silent. Then Victor laughed. It started as a single sharp exhale and built into something full and genuine and deeply cruel, the laugh of a man who had just watched something he found genuinely hilarious. Conrad joined him. Even Genevieve allowed herself a thin, satisfied smile. Harrison Cole stood, reached into a small evidence bag, and placed the coin on the table in front of Rosa. It spun once on the polished wood before settling flat. $1, heads up. "That's your inheritance," Victor said, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. $1 from a woman who apparently had nothing, which makes sense because the women in your family have always been good at having nothing. Rosa stared at the coin. 38 years of marriage, 2 children raised, a career abandoned, a life given over entirely to someone else's ambitions. And now this, her godmother's estate reduced to a joke, a prop, a punchline delivered in a conference room by a man who hadn't earned a single room he'd ever sat in. She reached for the coin, and that was when the door behind her opened. The man who stepped through the door was not what the room expected. He was perhaps 50 years old, lean and unhurried, wearing a dark jacket over a simple collared shirt with no tie. He carried no briefcase. He carried no folders or legal pads or any of the armor that attorneys typically wore into rooms like this one. He carried only a set of car keys, held loosely in one hand, and a small sealed envelope in the other, and he moved through the conference room with the calm and absolute certainty of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this exact moment and was in no rush to waste it now that it had finally arrived. "My name is Theodore Banks," he said, addressing the room without particular urgency. "I am the founding partner of Banks and Delgado, the firm that prepared and filed Catalina Vega's will and estate documents. I've been retained as counsel for Mrs. Rosa Mendez, effective as of this morning." Harrison Cole was on his feet before Theodore had finished the sentence. "Your Honor," he caught himself, recalibrated. There was no judge. This was a conference room, not a courtroom. He straightened his jacket instead. "Mr. Banks, this is highly irregular. Mrs. Mendez has not been represented throughout any of these proceedings. You cannot simply walk in at the moment of reading and..." I can, Theodore said simply, because she hired me, this morning, by phone, which is entirely legal and entirely her right. He looked at Rosa with calm, steady eyes. Don't touch that coin yet, Mrs. Mendez, please. Rosa's hand, which had been hovering over the dollar coin on the table, pulled back slowly. She looked at this man she had never seen before and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not hope exactly, but the distant possibility of it. Victor leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, the posture of a man performing patience he didn't feel. This is theater, he said. Whatever this is, it's theater. The will is clear. $1. It's been read. We're done here. We're not quite done, Theodore said. He placed the sealed envelope on the table but didn't open it. Instead, he looked at Gerald Fitch, the estate attorney, who was watching everything unfold with the expression of a man who had long suspected this reading was going to be more complicated than his schedule allowed. Mr. Fitch, I'd like to request a brief recess before we proceed. 10 minutes. Gerald Fitch looked at Harrison Cole, then at Victor, then at Theodore Banks, and made the decision that anyone in a room full of attorneys eventually makes when the situation exceeds their comfort level. He nodded, gathered his papers and stood. 10 minutes, he said. Conference room B is available. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Theodore led Rosa into the smaller room and closed the door behind them. For a moment he simply stood there, looking at her with an expression that mixed professional composure with something older and more personal, something that looked almost like relief. How did you know, Catalina? Rosa asked. It was not the question she had planned to ask first, but it was the one that came out. She hired me 22 years ago, Theodore said. When you had been married to Victor Hale for about 16 years, she came to my office alone, paid a retainer in cash, and told me she needed help structuring something very carefully over a very long period of time. She said she couldn't tell me everything right away. She said I would need to trust that it would make sense eventually. He paused. She was right. Rosa sat down slowly in one of the conference room chairs. What did she structure? Theodore sat across from her and placed the sealed envelope between them on the table. Before I answer that, I need to ask you something. Do you remember the last time you visited Catalina's apartment before she died? Rosa thought back. About a month before the stroke. I brought her tamales. We sat at her kitchen table for 3 hours. Did she give you anything that day? Rosa frowned, reaching back through her memory. She gave me a coin, an old one. She pressed it into my hand when I was leaving and said, Rosa stopped. Something cold and electric moved through her. She said, hold on to this. She said it like it was important, but I thought she was just being sentimental. I thought it was a keepsake. Where is that coin now? In my jewelry box. At home. I never... Rosa's voice faltered. It looked exactly like the one on the table in there. Theodore Banks nodded slowly. That's because it is exactly like the one on the table in there. They're a matched pair. Catalina had 2 struck from the same mold, dated the same year. She gave you one to keep. She arranged for the other to be presented at the reading. He folded his hands on the table. The coin Victor's attorney just placed in front of you isn't your inheritance, Mrs. Mendez. It's half of a coordinate. Rosa stared at him. The coin she gave you a month before she died, the one in your jewelry box right now, is the other half. Together they form a set of numbers, geographic coordinates to be precise, latitude and longitude engraved on the edges of each coin in a font small enough that most people would never notice it without knowing to look. He leaned forward slightly. Catalina spent the last 20 years of her life making absolutely certain that Victor Hale's attorneys would find exactly what they expected to find, a $1 inheritance for a woman they considered worthless. She made sure they would laugh. She needed them to laugh because laughing people stop looking. The room was very quiet. What's at the coordinates? Rosa asked, though something in the stillness of the air around her already knew the answer was going to change everything. Theodore Banks picked up his car keys from the table and turned them once in his hand. That's what I've been waiting 22 years to show you, he said. And if you're ready, I'd like to drive you there right now. Rosa called Marco from the parking lot while Theodore warmed up the car. She kept it brief because she didn't have words yet for what was happening, and because Marco had her father's temperament, steady and practical, the kind of man who needed facts rather than feelings to orient himself. She told him she was leaving with her new attorney. She told him it was important. She told him to call Lucia and ask her to meet them at the house first, so she could retrieve something from her jewelry box before they went anywhere else. Marco asked 3 questions in rapid succession, the way he always did when he was concerned but trying not to show it. Are you safe? Do you trust this person? Do you need me to come? She answered yes, yes, and not yet, and hung up before he could argue. Theodore drove a dark green sedan that was clean and unremarkable and about 8 years old, which Rosa noticed because it was the kind of detail Catalina would have approved of. Catalina had always said that people who drove flashy cars were advertising their insecurity. She had said a great many things like that, small compressed observations that Rosa had stored away over the years without always understanding their weight until much later. They drove to Rosa's house first. It was not the house she had shared with Victor, that had been sold during the divorce settlement, its proceeds divided through a formula that Rosa's limited legal representation at the time had been unable to meaningfully challenge. She was living now in a rented townhouse in a quiet part of the northeast side, modest and clean, with a small back patio where she had started growing herbs in clay pots because it gave her hands something to do in the evenings when the silence became too loud. Lucia was already there when they arrived, leaning against her car in the driveway with her arms crossed and her eyes moving immediately to Theodore with the appraising look she had inherited directly from Rosa's mother. Lucia was 34, sharp and protective in the way of youngest daughters who had watched their mothers absorb too much without complaining. "Who is this?" she said, not unkindly but clearly. "My attorney," Rosa said. "His name is Theodore Banks. He worked with Catalina." Lucia's expression shifted at Catalina's name, softened at the edges the way everyone's did who had known her. "Okay," she said simply, and followed them inside. The jewelry box was on Rosa's dresser, a plain wooden one with a small brass clasp that had been a gift from her mother years ago. Rosa opened it and moved through its contents carefully, a pair of pearl earrings, her mother's rosary, a thin gold bracelet Marco had given her for her 60th birthday, until her fingers found the coin. It was small and cool in her palm, a standard dollar coin at first glance, the kind you might receive as change at a parking meter or find forgotten at the bottom of a coat pocket. But when Rosa turned it in the light the way Theodore had instructed, tilting it until the edge caught the afternoon sun coming through the bedroom window, she saw them, numbers impossibly fine, engraved along the rim in 2 distinct sequences, tiny and deliberate and absolutely intentional. "There," Theodore said quietly from the doorway. Lucia leaned over her mother's shoulder and looked. "What is that?" "Half of where we're going," Theodore said. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and opened a maps application, then entered both sets of coordinates, the sequence from Rosa's coin and the sequence he had already noted from the coin at the estate reading. He turned the screen so Rosa could see. The pin landed on a small island off the Gulf Coast, accessible by a short ferry crossing from a coastal town about 2.5 hours south of San Antonio. The satellite image showed dense coastal vegetation, a private road running through the center, and at the southern tip, partially obscured by tree cover, the pale roof of a large structure. "I've never been there," Rosa said. "Catalina went every year," Theodore said. "For about 30 years. She always went alone, always in October, always for exactly 1 week. She told the people around her it was a wellness retreat. She told no one where it actually was." Rosa looked at the satellite image for a long moment, at the pale roof half hidden by trees, at the thin line of private road, at the blue water surrounding all of it. "She owned that island," Rosa said. It came out not as a question. "She owned the island," Theodore confirmed. "The structure on it was built in stages over about 15 years, using contractors brought in from 3 different states specifically so that no single team ever saw the complete picture. The property is registered under a holding company that Catalina incorporated in 1994. The holding company's sole beneficiary, structured through 2 layers of legal documentation that took me the better part of a decade to fully set up according to her instructions, is you." Lucia made a sound behind Rosa that was somewhere between a gasp and a laugh. "Why?" Rosa said slowly. "Did she go to all of this trouble? She could have simply left it to me. She could have simply told me." Theodore was quiet for a moment. When he answered, his voice had lost its professional evenness and carried something more careful and considered underneath. "Because she knew Victor," he said, "not personally, But she knew the type. She knew that if there was visible wealth attached to your name in any form during the marriage, his attorneys would find a way to reach it. She knew that the only way to protect something for you completely was to make sure it was invisible, not just hidden, invisible, something that looked like nothing, to anyone who wasn't meant to find it. He paused. She told me once that the greatest protection she could give you was to let the people who underestimated her continue to underestimate her. She said they would do most of the work for her. Rosa pressed the coin between her palms and closed her hands around it. She thought about Catalina at her small kitchen table, about 30 years of Thursday phone calls, about a woman who had lived in a rented apartment and driven an old car and worn clothes that were clean but never new, and who had apparently spent those same decades quietly and methodically building her goddaughter a fortress no attorney had ever found, because no attorney had ever thought to look. She let everyone think she had nothing, Rosa said softly. Yes, Theodore said, so that I would always have something. He nodded. Are you ready to go see it? Rosa looked at Lucia. Lucia looked back at her with eyes that were bright and slightly overwhelmed and completely certain. Go, Lucia said. I'm calling Marco. We'll meet you there. Rosa closed her jewelry box, put the coin carefully in her jacket pocket, and followed Theodore Banks back out to the unremarkable green sedan that was about to drive her to the life her godmother had spent 30 years building in secret, one careful, invisible brick at a time. The drive south took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Rosa spent most of it looking out the passenger window at the landscape changing around her, the dense suburban sprawl of San Antonio giving way to open highway, then to the flat coastal plain with its pale grasses and wide sky and the occasional heron standing motionless in a roadside ditch like something placed there deliberately to remind you to slow down. She had always loved this part of Texas. Victor had never understood why. He preferred mountains, preferred elevation, preferred landscapes that announced themselves. Rosa had always been drawn to the quiet ones, the ones that asked you to look more carefully before they gave themselves up. Theodore drove without filling the silence unnecessarily, which she appreciated. He answered her questions when she asked them and didn't perform conversation in the spaces between. It reminded her of Catalina, who had also understood that sometimes the most respectful thing you could offer another person was simply the room to think. She had questions, many of them. She asked them in the order they surfaced. How long have you known about the villa? I've known about the property since Catalina first hired me, Theodore said. She brought me the deed, the holding company documents, and the initial architectural plans all in the same meeting. She was extraordinarily organized. Everything was already in place. She needed me to manage the legal structure over time, make sure the documentation stayed clean and current, and wait. Just wait? Mostly wait, he said. And watch. She asked me to monitor the divorce proceedings when they began. She had left instructions for various triggering conditions, moments that would tell me it was time to make myself known. The estate reading was the final one. She was specific about it. She said that if Victor's attorneys ever attempted to file a claim against her estate, it meant they had finally overreached enough to expose themselves completely. She said that was the moment I would know you were free of any legal entanglement that might complicate the transfer. Rosa absorbed this. She anticipated that he would try to claim her estate. She anticipated everything, Theodore said, without exaggeration and without drama. That was perhaps the most remarkable thing about her. She didn't think in terms of what might happen. She thought in terms of what people like Victor always eventually do. She said that arrogant men follow patterns, and that patterns are predictable, and that predictable things can be planned around. Rosa turned this over in her mind for the rest of the drive. They reached the coastal town just before 2 in the afternoon. It was a small place, the kind that existed in quiet, productive parallel to the tourist economy without being consumed by it. A working marina, a hardware store, a bakery that smelled of salt and sugar from half a block away. Theodore parked near the dock and spoke briefly with a man who operated a small private ferry service, clearly familiar with him, clearly expecting them. Money changed hands. The ferry was ready. The crossing took 20 minutes. The island came into view gradually, the way significant things often do. First as a dark line on the horizon, then as a shape, then as something real and specific and undeniable. It was perhaps 40 acres, Rosa estimated, densely vegetated with live oaks and coastal scrub, surrounded by water that shifted between green and blue depending on where the light fell. There was a small private dock on the northern end where the ferry tied up, and from there a gravel road ran south through the trees. Theodore had arranged a golf cart. They followed the road. The villa revealed itself the way the island had, gradually through gaps in the tree cover, giving Rosa pieces of it before the whole. A white wall, a terracotta roof, a wide wooden gate standing open as though it had been expecting her. Then the road curved and the trees fell away, and Rosa saw all of it at once. It was not enormous. It was not the kind of place that announced wealth through sheer scale. It was perhaps 4,000 square feet, built in a Spanish colonial style that felt organic to the landscape rather than imposed upon it, with thick white stucco walls and deep-set windows and a wide covered veranda that wrapped around 3 sides of the structure. Bougainvillea grew up the southern wall in a cascade of deep magenta. A stone fountain sat in the central courtyard, dry now but intact, its basin filled with years of fallen leaves that no one had cleared because no one had been here to clear them. Rosa stepped out of the golf cart and stood in the courtyard and did not say anything for a long time. The air smelled of salt and vegetation and something older underneath, cedar perhaps, or the particular dry warmth of a place that holds the sun in its walls all day and releases it slowly after dark. The silence was not empty. It was full of the specific sounds of a place that is alive without being occupied. Birds in the oaks, wind moving through the veranda screens, water somewhere distant against the island's rocky southern edge. She built this, Rosa said finally. Over 15 years, Theodore confirmed. She used 4 different contractors, as I mentioned. She was the only person who ever saw it complete. She came every October and spent 1 week here alone, and then she locked it up and left and went back to her apartment and her altered clothes and her old car and her Thursday phone calls. Rosa walked slowly to the veranda and pressed her hand against the stucco wall. It was warm from the afternoon sun. She thought about Catalina driving down here alone every autumn, sitting on this veranda in October light, watching the water, knowing this was here, knowing it was safe, knowing it was waiting. Did she ever want to tell me? Rosa asked. Theodore came to stand beside her. She wrote about that in the instructions she left me. She said the hardest part was the silence. She said there were dozens of moments when she wanted to bring you here, to show you, to let you rest in it. But she said that if she told you, and if Victor ever found out, through anything, a phone call overheard, a document discovered, anything, his attorneys would find a way to reach it. She said the only way to love you properly in that circumstance was to love you quietly. Rosa felt tears arrive without warning, the sudden kind that bypass whatever composure you've been maintaining and simply appear. She didn't try to stop them. She thought about a woman sitting alone on this veranda every October for 15 years, watching the water, keeping quiet, loving her goddaughter loudly in every way that didn't make a sound. Behind her she heard the distant sound of a boat engine. She turned. Coming across the water from the mainland, moving steadily toward the island dock, was another ferry. Standing at the bow, visible even at this distance because of the way he stood, straight-backed, hands in his jacket pockets, the posture of a man trying to look calm when he was anything but, was Marco, and beside him, her dark hair catching the Gulf wind, was Lucia. Rosa raised her hand. Marco saw her and raised his back. She turned and looked at the villa again, at the bougainvillea, at the dry fountain, at the wide-covered veranda where Catalina had sat alone for 30 Octobers, keeping the most extravagant secret anyone had ever kept out of love. What happens next? Rosa asked. Legally, what can Victor actually do? Theodore was already shaking his head. Nothing. The property predates your marriage by 6 years. It was never in your name during the marriage, which means there is no marital property argument available to him. The holding company is structured so that even if his attorneys had discovered it during the divorce, they would have had no basis for a claim. Catalina made absolutely certain of that. She asked me to review it against every possible legal challenge approximately every 3 years for 2 decades. He paused. Victor's attorneys walked into that estate reading, believing they were watching you receive nothing. What they actually did was trigger the legal release of a property currently valued by the county assessor at approximately $3.2 million, with the island land itself appraised separately at an additional $1.8 million. Rosa was quiet. $5 million, she said. At minimum, Theodore said. The villa hasn't been updated since Catalina's last visit. With renovation it would be worth considerably more, and the island itself, private islands of this size on the Gulf Coast are increasingly rare. The land value will only increase. The ferry with Marco and Lucia was pulling up to the dock now. Rosa could hear Lucia's voice carrying across the water, asking the ferry operator something with the particular impatience of a woman who was trying very hard to be patient. Rosa smiled. She pressed her hand against the warm stucco wall one more time, feeling the sun stored inside it, and made a decision she hadn't known she was about to make until it was already made. She was going to restore it. Every room, every wall. She was going to clear the fountain and fill it and sit on the veranda every morning with coffee and watch the water the way Catalina had watched it, except she wasn't going to do it alone, and she wasn't going to do it in secret, and she wasn't going to do it for just 1 week a year. She was going to do it for the rest of her life, and it was going to be the beginning of something. Marco stood in the center of the villa's main living room and turned slowly in a full circle, the way he had as a child whenever they entered a new space, cataloging it completely before saying anything. He had his grandfather's eyes, dark and methodical and incapable of missing detail, and Rosa watched him use them now, moving across the high ceilings, the deep-set windows, the original tile floor in a pattern of terracotta and cream that was dusty but intact and clearly handmade. "Tia Catalina built this," he said finally. It came out as a statement rather than a question, but it had the quality of something a person says when they are still in the process of making it real. "She designed it," Theodore clarified from the doorway. "She worked with an architect on the structural plans, but the interior decisions, the layout, the materials, the details, those were entirely hers. The contractor told me she arrived at every site visit with hand-drawn sketches and didn't leave until every specification had been met." Lucia was already moving through the rooms, her phone out, photographing everything with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had decided that documentation was the appropriate response to the completely unexpected. She appeared in the doorway of what had been Catalina's bedroom, simply furnished, a wooden bed frame, a washstand, a single chair positioned to face the window that looked south toward open water, and held up her phone so Rosa could see the screen. "Look at the view from this window," Lucia said. Rosa crossed the room and looked. The window framed a rectangle of Gulf water so perfectly that it appeared almost deliberate, almost artistic, the way the best architecture always makes the outside world look like it was arranged specifically for the person standing inside looking out. The afternoon light was dropping now, pulling gold across the surface of the water, and a line of pelicans moved through the frame from left to right in the unhurried formation they always kept, as though they had been doing this particular route for decades and saw no reason to change it. "She sat here," Rosa said softly, "every October." "Looking at this, every October for 15 years, Marco said from behind her. His voice had shifted. He was not a man who cried easily. He had his grandfather's composure in that regard as well. But Rosa recognized the particular flatness that came into his voice when he was working to maintain it. She turned and looked at her son. He was 41 years old, broad-shouldered and serious, a structural engineer who spent his days thinking about the hidden frameworks that held things upright. She thought about how appropriate that was. She thought about how much of Catalina he carried without knowing it. "Your great godmother loved you both," Rosa said. She never said it the way most people do. But this, she gestured at the room, the window, the water outside. This is what her love looked like when she had the space to show it fully. Marco pressed his lips together and nodded once and looked back at the window. They spent the remainder of the afternoon moving through the villa room by room. There were 6 bedrooms in total, each furnished simply but with clear intention. The right chair in the right corner, the right window facing the right direction, the right amount of space between things. A large kitchen with a wood-burning stove and hand-painted tiles along the backsplash. A study lined with empty bookshelves, as though Catalina had known someone else would fill them. A back terrace on the southern end facing the open Gulf, with a low stone wall and 4 iron chairs arranged in a semicircle that caught the last of the afternoon sun perfectly. "She left this for you to read when you were ready," Theodore said. "She was specific that it shouldn't be read in the attorney's office or during any formal proceeding. She said it was for when you were standing somewhere that made sense." Rosa picked up the envelope and looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked out the kitchen window at the back terrace, at the 4 iron chairs facing the water, at the sky that was beginning to move from gold into the soft, deep blue that comes just before the Gulf Coast dark. "I'd like to read it outside," she said. She carried the letter to the terrace and sat in the iron chair that faced most directly south, the one that would have caught the last of the sun on an October afternoon if October had been the month and the sun had been at the angle it reached in autumn. She thought about Catalina sitting here. She thought about 30 years of silence kept out of love. Then she broke the seal and unfolded the letter and began to read. "My Rosa," it began, "if you are reading this, then the moment I prepared for has come, and you have survived it, which means you are stronger than you gave yourself credit for, which is something I always knew and you never quite believed. I want to explain some things. When you married Victor Hale, I knew within the first year what kind of man he was, not because he was openly cruel, he wasn't, not then, but because I watched the way he listened when you talked about your own dreams. There is a particular expression that certain people wear when someone they consider beneath them speaks about something they want for themselves. It is not contempt exactly, it is closer to indifference, as though the other person's inner life is a minor administrative detail that doesn't require real engagement. Victor wore that expression every time you talked about architecture, about design, about the things that made you come alive. He wore it so naturally that I don't think he even knew he was wearing it. I decided that year to build you a door, not a safety net, not a backup plan, a door, something that would be standing open for you whenever you were finally ready to walk through it, something that no one could lock from the outside because no one would know it existed. I chose this island because I found it by accident on a drive south in 1993, and I stood on its northern shore for an hour watching the water and thought, Rosa would love this. I bought it 3 months later for less than you would believe, because at that time no one had discovered what coastal land on the Gulf would become worth, and because I looked like exactly what I was, an old woman with modest means making an eccentric purchase. People rarely look twice at eccentric old women. I have found that to be one of the more useful facts of my life. I built this villa for you the way your father laid tile, carefully, quietly, one piece at a time, making sure every piece was exactly right before moving to the next. I furnished it the way I imagined you would want it, though I know your taste better than you think I do after all these years. I faced the bedroom window south because I knew that if you ever sat in that room you would want to look at open water rather than land. The fountain in the courtyard needs to be cleared and filled. I kept meaning to do it and kept running out of October. Use this place, Rosa. Fill those bookshelves. Plant something in the courtyard that will grow back every year. Bring your children and your grandchildren when they come. Sit on the back terrace in the morning with coffee and watch the pelicans because they fly the same route every day and it is deeply comforting once you know to look for it. And know that every October when I sat here alone, I was sitting here for both of us. I was holding your share of this quiet until you were free to come and claim it yourself. You were always worth this, my Rosa. You were always worth everything. With all the love I had, always, your Catalina. Rosa folded the letter carefully along its original creases and held it in both hands and looked out at the Gulf water going dark under the evening sky. Behind her she heard Marco and Lucia come out onto the terrace, heard them sit in the other iron chairs without asking whether she was ready for company, understanding somehow that she needed them close without needing them to speak. The pelicans came through one more time before the light failed completely. Rosa watched them until they were gone. Victor found out on a Tuesday. Rosa hadn't told him. She hadn't told anyone outside of Marco, Lucia, Theodore, and Arthur. She had hired a local estate attorney named Arthur Delgado, Theodore's partner, to handle the formal property transfer documentation and the holding company restructuring that would move everything cleanly into Rosa's name. She had been deliberate and quiet about all of it, the way Catalina had taught her to be deliberate and quiet about things that mattered. But Victor had always had sources. People who kept him informed about things he considered his business, which had historically included Rosa, even after she had legally ceased to be any of his business whatsoever. His brother Conrad ran in the same coastal real estate circles where private island transactions, even ones carefully structured through holding companies, eventually became known to people who paid attention to such things. Conrad had apparently paid attention. Victor called on a Tuesday morning while Rosa was sitting on the back terrace with coffee, watching the pelicans make their first pass of the day across the southern water. She had been on the island for 3 weeks. She had hired a small local restoration crew to begin work on the villa, starting with the fountain which had been cleared and filled and now ran with a sound that she had decided was the best sound she had ever heard in a building she owned. She had ordered books for the study shelves. She had planted bougainvillea along the north wall to match the cascade on the south side that Catalina had planted years ago and that had continued to bloom regardless of whether anyone was watching. She looked at Victor's name on her phone screen for a long moment. Then she answered, because she found that she was no longer afraid of his voice and wanted to confirm that for herself. Rosa. His tone was the one she recognized from the later years of their marriage, controlled, deliberate, designed to establish that he was the reasonable one in whatever conversation was about to happen. "I've been hearing some interesting things." "Good morning, Victor," she said. A pause. He hadn't expected pleasantness. "I'm hearing that you've come into some kind of property." "Through Catalina's estate." "That's correct. I want you to know that my attorneys are reviewing the situation. There are questions about the timeline of the acquisition and whether certain assets accumulated during—" "Victor," Rosa said. She kept her voice entirely even. "Your attorneys already reviewed Catalina's estate. They were in the room when the will was read. They filed a claim, and the claim was evaluated, and there was no legal basis for it. Theodore Banks has the documentation if you need it reviewed again." "That was before we knew the full extent." "The full extent was always there," Rosa said. "Your attorneys simply didn't find it because they were looking for what they expected to find, which was nothing. They found nothing, and they were satisfied with nothing, and they stopped looking. That was their choice." She paused. It was also, I think, something Catalina counted on. Silence on the line. She could hear him recalibrating. "You're not going to fight this," he said finally. It came out not as a question, but as something he was telling himself as much as her. "There's nothing to fight," Rosa said. "The property is mine. It was always going to be mine. Catalina made sure of that 20 years before you decided our marriage was no longer convenient for you. She watched a pelican drop suddenly from its formation and dive toward the water in a clean arc. I don't have anything else to say to you about this. If your attorneys have specific legal questions, they can direct them to Theodore Banks. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you didn't call this number again." She hung up. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hand, waiting to feel something complicated, residual fear or grief, or the particular exhaustion that his voice had reliably produced in her for the last 3 years of their marriage. But what she felt was simpler than any of that. She felt the morning sun on her face. She felt the coffee warm in her hands. She heard the fountain running in the courtyard behind her. She watched the pelican surface from its dive with something in its bill and rejoin its formation, as though the interruption had been entirely routine. Victor's attorneys had no legal avenue available to them. The property had been acquired in 1993, 6 years before Rosa and Victor's marriage. It had been held continuously in a corporate structure that bore no connection to Rosa's name until the moment of Catalina's death triggered the transfer. Every document had been reviewed against the specific terms of Rosa's divorce settlement, which contained no language broad enough to reach an asset of this nature. Harrison Cole, Victor's lead attorney, had apparently reviewed the situation himself and reached the same conclusion because the call from Victor's firm to Theodore's office that afternoon was brief and did not result in any filing. Victor was done. He simply didn't know yet how to be done gracefully, which Rosa had decided was not her problem to solve. What was her problem, or rather, her project, her purpose, the thing that had been taking shape in her mind since the morning she had first stood in the villa's courtyard and pressed her hand against Catalina's warm stucco wall, was something considerably more interesting. She had spent the 3 weeks on the island not only overseeing the restoration but also reading. The empty bookshelves in Catalina's study had been partially filled now with the books she had ordered, but also with something she hadn't anticipated finding, a series of journals, 12 of them, discovered in a cedar chest in the study's storage closet, each one dated and filled with Catalina's angular handwriting. They were not personal diaries exactly. They were something between a business record and a philosophical document, notes on every transaction Catalina had made over 40 years, annotated with her thinking, her reasoning, the considerations she had weighed, and the conclusions she had reached. Reading them had been like hearing Catalina's voice again, but a fuller version of it, the version that had existed beneath the Thursday phone calls and the compressed observations and the deliberate simplicity of her visible life. Catalina had been, Rosa understood now, a genuinely brilliant financial mind. Not formally trained, she had never attended university, had never worked in finance or law or business in any official capacity. But she had possessed the kind of intelligence that operates on instinct refined by observation, the kind that looks at a system and immediately understands where its pressure points are and how they can be used. She had bought the island when coastal land was undervalued. She had built the villa in stages to avoid drawing attention. She had structured her finances through multiple layers of documentation, not because she had been taught to do so, but because she had reasoned her way to that conclusion independently and then found attorneys who could execute it. She had done all of this while appearing to have nothing. Rosa sat in the study one evening with the journals spread around her and thought about that, about the particular invisibility that Catalina had weaponized, about how the same quality that Victor's family had used to dismiss Rosa, her background, her immigrant roots, the assumption that people from certain places with certain histories didn't accumulate real wealth or real power, had been the precise quality Catalina had used to protect everything she built. They had looked at Catalina and seen an old woman with modest means, so they had never looked again. Rosa thought about how many other women there were like that, how many people, women especially, immigrant women especially, who had built things quietly and carefully and invisibly because visibility had never been safe, and who had no one to help them structure those things properly, to protect them legally, to ensure they survived beyond a single lifetime. She thought about that for a long time. Then she opened her notebook, a plain one, purchased at the small hardware store in the coastal town on her second day on the island, and began writing. Not a journal, not a record of transactions, something more like a plan. At the top of the first page she wrote 3 words and underlined them twice. The Catalina Vega Foundation. She didn't know yet exactly what shape it would take. She knew it would involve legal resources. She knew it would involve financial education. She knew it would involve helping people protect what they built from the people who assumed they had built nothing. She knew it would be built on this island, in this villa, in the place Catalina had constructed out of love and silence and 30 years of patient, invisible labor. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping, the fountain audible from the courtyard, through the study's open window, the gulf dark and present beyond the southern terrace. When Marco called that evening to check in, she answered before the second ring. "I need to talk to you about something," she said. "I have an idea, a real one, and I'm going to need your help." The Catalina Vega Foundation opened its doors 18 months after Rosa first wrote those 3 words in her plain notebook in the island study. The launch was not a grand event. Rosa had deliberately kept it small, an afternoon gathering on the villa's back terrace, the Gulf water bright behind the low stone wall, the restored fountain audible from the courtyard, the bougainvillea on both walls now in full bloom, the deep magenta of the south wall meeting the newer growth on the north in a way that made the whole facade look like something designed by someone who had loved this place completely, which, Rosa supposed, it had been. 40 people attended: Theodore Banks, Arthur Delgado, Marco and Lucia, and Marco's wife Elena and their 2 children, who spent most of the afternoon investigating the island's shoreline with the focused intensity of people who had discovered something they intended to claim. A dozen women from San Antonio and the surrounding region who had responded to the quiet outreach Rosa and Theodore had conducted over the preceding months. Women who had built things, created things, accumulated things quietly and without visibility, and who had no reliable legal or financial infrastructure to protect what they had made. 3 attorneys who had agreed to volunteer their expertise, a professor of financial planning from a state university who had driven 4 hours after reading about the foundation's mission in a small regional publication, and Maria Vega, Catalina's younger sister, now 81 years old, who had flown in from her home in Mexico City with the assistance of Lucia, who had tracked her down through 6 weeks of careful research and a series of phone calls conducted in the careful, formal Spanish that Lucia used when she wanted to show respect. Maria had wept when she arrived at the island dock and seen the villa for the first time. She had stood in the courtyard beside the fountain for a long time without speaking. Then she had looked at Rosa and said, in Spanish, "She told me she had a project. She never told me what it was. Now I understand." Rosa had held Maria's hands and said, "She built it for both of us, for all of us." The foundation's mission was specific and practical, shaped by everything Rosa had learned from Catalina's journals and from her own experience. It provided free legal services to women from working-class and immigrant backgrounds who had created intellectual or physical assets, small inventions, business innovations, property acquired through years of careful saving, and who lacked the resources to protect those assets through proper legal structure. It offered financial education workshops focused specifically on asset protection, holding company formation, and the kind of long-range planning that Catalina had conducted entirely on instinct, because no one had ever taught her the formal language for what she was already doing intuitively. And it provided a small grants program for women over 50 who were rebuilding financial independence after divorce or loss, because Rosa understood from her own experience that the need didn't stop at an age that the culture considered appropriate for starting over. The villa itself served as the foundation's operational base and retreat center. Rosa had furnished the 6 bedrooms as guest rooms where foundation clients could come for weekend workshops, using Catalina's original furniture supplemented carefully with pieces that honored the style and spirit of what was already there. The study's bookshelves were full now. The kitchen produced 3 meals a day when guests were present, cooked by a woman named Dolores from the coastal town who had the particular gift of making food that made people feel that someone had been thinking about them specifically when it was prepared. Rosa had moved into the villa permanently 6 months after the foundation's incorporation, bringing her herbs from the clay pots on her rented townhouse patio and replanting them in a kitchen garden she established along the villa's eastern wall. She woke every morning before sunrise and sat on the back terrace with coffee and watched the Gulf go from black to gray to the particular luminous blue it became when the sun cleared the horizon behind her, and she watched the pelicans make their first pass of the day, and she thought about Catalina sitting in this same chair in October light, holding the quiet of this place in trust for someone she loved. She thought about that every morning. She suspected she always would. Victor's situation had continued its decline without any contribution from Rosa. His bankruptcy filing had moved through the courts in the way of such things, slowly, expensively, with the particular indignity of having one's financial architecture examined in detail by people whose job it was to find what had been obscured. Several of the business structures he had used to shelter assets during the divorce were now being scrutinized in the bankruptcy proceedings in ways that his attorneys were finding difficult to manage. Conrad had quietly distanced himself from Victor's business interests. Genevieve had stopped attending the social events where their family's name had once been a reliable form of currency. Rosa did not follow these developments closely. She heard about them through Marco, who kept a watchful eye on them the way a structural engineer monitors a building he knows has compromised foundations, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the professional attention of someone who had predicted the outcome and needed to confirm it. She received the updates and filed them away and returned to whatever she had been doing, which was almost always something that mattered more than Victor. Brianna, the 29-year-old for whom Victor had dismantled a 38-year marriage, had left him 14 months after the divorce was finalized. Rosa had felt nothing in particular when she heard this. She had learned, in the months of island mornings and foundation work and Catalina's journals, that other people's consequences were not her responsibility to feel deeply about. What she felt responsible for was considerably more interesting and considerably more demanding of her attention. She had, in the first year of the foundation's operation, helped 11 women properly structure and legally protect assets they had spent years accumulating without adequate protection. One of them was a 67-year-old retired housekeeper from Corpus Christi who had quietly purchased 3 small rental properties over 20 years using savings from a lifetime of careful work, and who had no will, no legal structure, and no understanding of how vulnerable those properties were to family disputes or creditor claims. The foundation's attorneys had spent 40 hours on her situation and resolved it completely. The woman had sat in the villa's kitchen afterward with Dolores's coffee and wept with a relief so profound it had made Rosa understand, with a clarity she felt in her chest rather than her mind, why Catalina had spent 30 years building this place. On the foundation's first anniversary, Rosa drove to San Antonio and visited the cemetery where Catalina was buried. It was October, the month Catalina had always come to the island, and the day had the quality that October days in Texas sometimes have. The air cooled and clarified after summer, the light carrying a particular angle that made everything look considered. She brought flowers and the foundation's first annual report, 32 pages documenting every client served, every legal matter resolved, every workshop conducted, every grant disbursed. She sat beside the headstone and read parts of it aloud, the way she had always talked to Catalina during the Thursday calls, not waiting for responses but finding comfort in the direction of her words. We helped 43 women this year, she said, 11 with legal structures, 19 with financial planning, 13 with the grants program. One woman in Laredo protected a patent for a kitchen tool she invented that a larger company had been using without compensation for 6 years. We got her a settlement. She called me the day it came through and said she didn't know what to say, and I told her that Catalina would have told her to stop crying and invest it properly, and she laughed for about 30 seconds straight. She placed her hand on the headstone. Victor called once more 2 months ago. He didn't say much. His voice sounded smaller than I remembered it. I told him I hoped he found his way through, and I meant it. And then I said goodbye, and I haven't heard from him since. A breeze moved through the cemetery, carrying the smell of cut grass and distant rain. I sit on the terrace every morning, Catalina. I watch the pelicans. I drink the coffee. I think about you holding all of that quiet for 30 years so that I could have it when I needed it most. Rosa's voice steadied itself carefully. I am using every single October now. I am not leaving any of them unused. She stood, brushed grass from her pants, looked at the headstone one last time. Thank you, she said, for the island, for the villa, for the 30 years of Thursday calls, for the coins, for loving me loudly in every way that didn't make a sound, for knowing that the people who thought we had nothing would be the ones to hand us everything. She walked back to her car in the October light. Her phone showed a message from Lucia, a photograph of the villa's courtyard taken that morning, the fountain running, the bougainvillea full on both walls, 2 of the foundation's current guests sitting in the iron chairs on the back terrace with coffee, looking south at the water. Below the photograph, Lucia had written 4 words. Catalina would be proud. Rosa looked at the photograph for a long time, at the fountain, at the flowers, at the 2 women sitting in the October light in the chairs Catalina had placed facing south because she had known that the view from that angle was the one worth keeping. Then she started the car and drove back to the island, where she had work to do, the kind of work that Catalina had made possible, the kind that would outlast her, the kind that proved that the most powerful thing a person could build was not a business or a property or a legal structure, but the quiet, ironclad certainty in someone they loved, that they had always been worth protecting. Rosa Mendez was 67 years old. She had lost 38 years to a man who had decided she was worth $1. But she had an island and a foundation and a fountain that ran every morning, and the rest of her life stretching out in front of her like the gulf at sunrise, wide and full of light and completely, unmistakably hers. They had handed her a coin to break her. She had used it to find her way home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.